Hello and welcome to the NIST Privacy Framework at a Glance. My name is Dylan Gilbert, Privacy Policy Advisor with the NIST Privacy Engineering team, and I'll be your tour guide during this webinar as we take a relatively quick look at version 1.0 of the Privacy Framework to help familiarize you with the document and its companion resources. The Privacy Framework is the product of an open and transparent development process. NIST gathered public comments and feedback at 3 public workshops held across the country from a broad and diverse set of stakeholder participants representing private industry, the public sector, academia, and civil society. Version 1.0 of the framework was released in January of 2020. We'll get started today by highlighting the value we think that privacy framework adoption can bring to an organization. So this is the heart of what the privacy framework is about. Privacy framework supports organizations in 3 key ways. The first is by building trust. Establishing and maintaining trust is critical for any organization that's processing data. The privacy framework can help organizations build that trust by supporting ethical decision-making in product and service design or deployment that optimizes beneficial uses of data while minimizing adverse consequences for individuals' privacy and for society as a whole. The privacy framework takes a flexible, risk-based approach to privacy. Privacy risk assessments can help organizations find that sweet spot between optimizing beneficial uses of data and minimizing adverse consequences. Second, the privacy framework can help organizations fulfill their current compliance obligations and future-proof products and services to continue meeting these obligations in a changing technological and policy environment. The privacy framework is law and regulation agnostic. The approach is to help organizations identify key outcomes and activities that map to their compliance obligations. They can then actually demonstrate all the activities they are carrying out to meet those obligations. It helps organizations to establish traceability with their products and services and answer the really important question of how they're meeting their compliance requirements. Finally, the privacy framework facilitates communication about privacy practices across the data processing ecosystem, whether that be with individual customers, business or agency partners, or assessors and regulators. The broad shifting nature of privacy has made it difficult to communicate clearly about privacy risks within, between, and among organizations and with individuals. This framework is intended to fill that gap by providing a common language for talking about privacy risk. The framework can also be useful for communicating with, for example, regulators, going back to the compliance point, to show what activities you've undertaken to support legal compliance. A lot of important details here in this slide, so we want to take some time to walk through it. Having a general understanding of the different origins of cybersecurity and privacy risks is important for determining the most effective solutions to address such risks. During the privacy framework development process, we worked with stakeholders to create this Venn diagram to convey the relationship between cybersecurity and privacy risk. Starting on the left side of the diagram, cybersecurity risks are commonly understood to arise from the loss of CIA, confidentiality, integrity, or availability. The overlap of cybersecurity and privacy risk there in the center comes in when we talk about, for example, unauthorized access to personally identifiable information, or PII. Managing cybersecurity risk certainly contributes to managing privacy risk, but it's not sufficient. Privacy risk can also arise by means unrelated to cybersecurity incidents and unauthorized activities such as data breaches. The privacy framework approach to privacy risk, then, on the right side of the diagram, is to consider privacy events as potential problems that individuals could experience arising from system, product, or service operations that are carried out to meet organizational mission or business objectives. This applies whether the data are in digital or non-digital form and through the complete life cycle from data collection through disposal. These data operations are described in the singular as a data action and collectively as data processing. The problems that individuals, and by individuals we're talking about either singly or in groups, including at a societal level, the problems that these individuals can experience as a result of data processing can be expressed in various ways, but NIST describes them as ranging from dignity-type effects, such as embarrassment or stigmas, to more tangible harms, such as discrimination, economic loss, or physical harm. You can see key terms defined on the right side of the slide. These are an important part of establishing the common privacy risk vocabulary that I talked about before. This common vocabulary already exists in cybersecurity, but less so in privacy. For example, when we talk about privacy risk, we're talking about the likelihood that individuals will experience problems that result from data processing and the impact should those problems occur. We use likelihood and impact language to mirror cybersecurity, but here in the case of privacy, the focus is on the problems that individuals could experience instead of threats and vulnerabilities. An example of this aspect of privacy risk in practice is smart meters. Some communities have had concerns about smart meters, not for security issues, but because they collect such granular data about home electrical use. They were concerned that utility companies could build a narrative around what they're doing privately within their homes. These are unintended consequences arising from how data is processed for operational purposes and, in fact, for beneficial purposes, which was to make energy use more efficient. We call this an enterprise risk management tool for a reason. We think that part of the framework's utility is helping to draw the connection between privacy risk that individuals experience and organizational risk that is typically managed at the organizational level. When problems arise from data processing, individuals can experience the direct impact, as I mentioned, things like embarrassment, discrimination, and economic loss. And organizations can, in turn, experience follow-on impacts, for example, customer abandonment, non-compliance costs, or harm to reputation or internal culture, which could manifest in something like an employee walkout. Privacy risks and the problems that individuals experience resulting from data processing need to be made visible to organizations. So we describe these in terms of impacts that could be drivers in terms of how organizations allocate budget and resources to strengthen their privacy programs. We hope that this will help bring privacy into parity with the other risks that organizations are trying to manage in their overall enterprise risk portfolio. And while we're on the topic of privacy risk, one thing to note is that the role of the privacy framework is not to provide detailed information on how to do a privacy risk assessment. But privacy risk assessment is a critical sub-process for identifying, evaluating, prioritizing, and responding to particular privacy risks in a way that will get to the best solutions that are tailored to the risks that an organization has identified. So, given that privacy risk management is less mature than cybersecurity risk management, we built out an appendix, Appendix D, to provide some key privacy risk management practices to better support those organizations that are looking for some additional guidelines for privacy risk management. I won't go into detail here for the sake of time, but a couple of examples of the risk management practices that we cover in Appendix D are organizing preparatory resources, which covers topics like risk management, role assignments, and determining organizational level privacy requirements. And we also have a section on risk assessment, including a discussion of the NIST Privacy Risk Assessment Methodology, or PRAM as we call it, which is a model that organizations are free to use as a means to calculate privacy risk. Okay, now let's take a look at the basic structure of the privacy framework. If you already have some knowledge or experience with the cybersecurity framework, these elements will look very familiar. Early in the development process, stakeholder feedback strongly indicated a desire for structural alignment between the cybersecurity framework and the privacy framework. That's why we're using the same triad of core, profiles, and implementation tiers, as you can see here. The core offers an increasingly granular set of outcomes and activities to enable an organizational dialogue about privacy risk management. Having that collaboration and dialogue is really at the heart of risk management, no matter what discipline you're in. It's a discussion about risks, prioritization, trade-offs, costs, and more, and it needs to occur across the organization. One thing to emphasize is the core is not a checklist, it's not a compliance checklist, and it's not a restatement of law or principles. Rather, think of it more like a menu of options, which brings us to the profiles. Profiles are the next step in helping organizations have a privacy risk management conversation. An organization can use the core like a menu and select which functions, categories, and subcategories will help it manage privacy risk and prioritize activities. Organizations can build a current profile to reflect where its privacy program is and a target profile to reflect where it needs to be. Finally, implementation tiers are another communication device. They can help organizations discuss whether they have the resources, such as a workforce capable of managing privacy risk, for example, and the processes in place to meet their target profiles. We think this structure is useful not only for making it easier for organizations to use the privacy framework and the cybersecurity framework together, but it also supports the key attributes of the privacy framework, which are that it's risk and outcome based, it's flexible and scalable, and we designed it to facilitate communication between privacy professionals and non-professionals alike. Let's quickly take a closer look at the general structure of the core. For the visual learners out there, this slide illustrates what we mean when we say that it's an increasingly granular set of activities and outcomes. Starting with the functions on the left, functions are high-level outcomes. As we'll see in a bit, they can be useful for talking about privacy risks with organizational decision makers and senior leaders. And now working left to right through the categories and down to subcategories, those are the building blocks between policies and capabilities so that legal, compliance, and engineering domains can collaborate on implementation with more specificity. I want to briefly highlight each function before we move on, starting with identify. Much like the cybersecurity framework, this is where foundational risk management activities like risk assessment can be found. Inventory and data mapping activities are also located here. Moving on, we heard a lot from stakeholders about the importance of governance. And this is a function that doesn't exist in the cybersecurity framework. The govern function covers a lot of enterprise level activities like policy creation, workforce awareness and training, and ongoing monitoring and review. The categories and subcategories in the control function get at the outcomes and activities that are necessary to manage data with sufficient granularity to address privacy risks. Control is the home, for example, of a disassociated processing category, which contains outcomes that include de-identification or other technical data processing solutions that can increase disassociability consistent with an organization's risk strategy. Communicate function provides outcomes that emphasize the two-way street between organizations and individuals and between and among members of the data processing ecosystem. And lastly, but certainly not leastly, we have protect. You probably noticed the -P on all of these function names, which indicates that they're part of the privacy framework. This is particularly relevant here with the protect function because it has a lot of overlap with the cybersecurity framework categories and subcategories that are related to protecting data. But we've shaped the privacy framework function to be viewed through a privacy lens, so to speak, which is indicated by the -P. Okay, let's shift gears now to the important process of privacy framework implementation. This slide covers an entire section of the framework, but for the sake of time, I won't discuss all of these possible uses. One thing we want to emphasize, though, is that there is no one way or correct way to use the privacy framework. There are many ways to use it, and that's part of its flexibility. We wanted to design it so that the privacy framework could meet organizations where they are. Some organizations may be in the beginning stages of establishing a privacy program, and so we try to create a very simple ready, set, go model in terms of how to use the core profiles and implementation tiers to help organizations create or improve a privacy program. We have some supplemental materials on our website to help organizations with this in the form of hypothetical use cases with partial profiles to show organizations what collaboration may look like using ready, set, go to walk through the process. And we welcome you to check them out and see if they're helpful. And over time, we hope to collect and share real-world use cases from organizations in our resource repository for the greater good of the community. So one exciting development for us on the NIST privacy team is based on our stakeholder engagement over the past year. We're now learning how organizations are using the privacy framework to meet their goals. The next couple of slides show at a generalized level some of the ways organizations have used the framework. And one example here of how it's been used is to facilitate a high-level conversation with leadership about how the organization's privacy program is organized and where they need to go. Although this is a simplified example, we heard from one organization that matched their privacy program components against the functions and assigned red, yellow, and green tags to show where the program was today and where they thought it needed to be. Note that not everything here needs to be green. It's all based on an organization's priorities. Here, this organization was able to take a simple chart like this into a meeting with senior management, and they created an aha moment, so to speak, of understanding. And this was a very lightweight effort and shows that using the framework doesn't have to be an intensive undertaking. We know that organizations already have long to-do lists, and the privacy framework doesn't need to be another item to add to the list. This next example, also quite simplified, shows a more in-depth use of the framework. This organization was already using the cybersecurity framework, so they took the policy and technical requirements and the associated controls they'd already identified with the cybersecurity framework, and they ran a gap analysis against the privacy framework categories and subcategories. And what this allowed them to do was use the overlap to avoid reinventing the wheel and simply map a smaller set of new requirements and corresponding controls against the gaps. Merging its existing cybersecurity controls with its new privacy controls allowed the organization to integrate its risk management program into one that took both privacy and security risks into consideration. Resources. Resources play a very important role in privacy framework implementation. We've created the Privacy Framework Resource Repository to collect resources that support organizations' use of the framework. NIST encourages community contributions and feedback on these resources as part of our ongoing collaborative effort to improve implementation of the privacy framework. We put these resources online so that we can maximize flexibility as resources get updated and to avoid falling out of step with the latest resources that become available. Among the resources populating the repository are crosswalks, which map the framework to and from a variety of laws, regulations, and certifications. And the repository also contains numerous guidelines and tools to assist with privacy framework implementation. You can see a few of those listed, such as our privacy risk assessment methodology that I mentioned earlier, and a mapping to NIST's integrated catalog of privacy and security controls in special publication 853. Again, these resources are community generated, and so we always welcome more. Now that we've walked you through the basics of the privacy framework, what are the next steps? Well, this adorable pooch is unfortunately not available for adoption. However, the privacy framework absolutely is, and we hope that your organization will consider adopting our tool. By using version 1.0, you can show leadership in privacy, which is really important to help drive broader adoption. And please reach out to us if you're interested in sharing a quote in support of the framework. We'd love to share your perspective on our website. Also, now that version 1.0 has been out for a year, we'd love to hear from organizations about how they're using it, including challenges that they may have faced with implementation. Think of the privacy framework as a living document. So this implementation feedback from stakeholders is really extremely valuable to help us identify areas in which the framework can be improved. And finally, as I mentioned before, we welcome contributions to our resource repository like crosswalks, profiles, use cases, and implementation tools so that other organizations in the community can benefit from them. Briefly, I wanted to touch on our roadmap. Similar to the cybersecurity framework, we've created a companion roadmap to the privacy framework. And this roadmap captures priority challenges and gap areas for organizations, as well as activities to help address those challenges on topics ranging from emerging technologies like AI, artificial intelligence, to privacy workforce. These priority areas were put into the roadmap based on feedback we received through the framework development process. And the roadmap is a way to keep us accountable to ensure that we're making sufficient progress on supporting the development of privacy risk management and meeting our stakeholder needs. Our collaboration with stakeholders to address these challenges is ongoing, and we always welcome feedback, including if there are areas that you think we should add to the list. Okay, before we conclude, here are links to some resources to help you engage and stay up to date on the latest developments with the privacy framework and our related work streams. Be sure to visit our website to take a deeper dive into the privacy framework and all that it has to offer. And here's the link to sign up to our mailing list for periodic updates. There are also a variety of ways to contact us, including email or via Twitter if you're partial to social media. And with that, we will wrap up the presentation. So on behalf of the entire privacy engineering team, thanks for taking the time to join me for a quick glance at the Privacy Framework version 1.0. We hope that you found it helpful and that you'll consider using our tool. Thank you again and have a great day.